Okay, so in the last video I gave you an overview. Now I want to show you how I ended up with this result according to my grid. So I actually have a couple of documents open. One is a different size overall. This is the one you saw in class. If it'll open, there you go. And this is my previous work with my camouflage culture zine that I told you guys I was creating. And I've created a fairly simple grid in this case. It's just 12 over 12. I arrived at that kind of arbitrarily. It does have gutters. I'll pull that up really quickly. So this is 12 over 12 with a gutter that is equal to 1 pica, which is 12 points. Now that doesn't correspond to my baseline grid, and that's okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. This one, however, does correspond to both my baseline grid and the gutters involved. So if we were to turn on the baseline grid, you can see that those perfectly correlate. If we go back to this original document and we turn on that baseline grid, you can see that they don't. They're close, but they're not quite there. And that's okay. You don't even have to get that fancy with things. The first thing you're going to want to do is set up a new document. So we'll begin with that now. I'm going to press Command N. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to select my page size, which for us is going to be 5 inches wide and 8 inches tall. I'm going to set my bleeds to 0.125 inches, which is 9 points. And then I'm going to actually just leave the amount of pages at 1 for right now. Click OK. And we have a brand new shiny document without anything else in it. We can go ahead and click over here on the Pages palette and add a few new pages so that we have at least one spread to look at. And now, obviously, this is where things get a little, at least for me in the beginning, overwhelming because I'm just staring at blank pages. It's kind of like staring at blank pages in a sketchbook or something. Too many possibilities, and that's where the grid comes in. So when I showed you guys the type trials, I referenced something called Jan Tschichold's kind of classically referenced grid. It's just 9 over 9. And the way you make that is to go up to Layout, Create Guides, and we'll say 9, 0, 9, 0. Now you could really do this with just about anything. You could say 12 over 12, and again 12 shows up a lot in grids because it's divisible by 2 and 3 and 4 and 6. So it gives you some options when you're creating something that is meant to be modular. But you could always just go 9 over 9 and let that kind of determine hang lines and everything else. However, as we mentioned, that doesn't really reconcile or begin to even consider a baseline grid. And so your baseline grid, I'm going to hit Command K. You can find it up here under Grids. And this number right here should correspond to whatever your letting is, as we mentioned in class. So if you were at a typeface of 10 over 12, then that needs to stay at 12. If yours is 11 over 14, like mine is, this could be 14. However, I will mention that you can also, sometimes it's convenient at least, to make this half so that you're getting 2 lines for every leaded line, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. But we'll just go ahead and set it at 14 point, or excuse me, 7 point. And we'll change the view threshold to 50%. That's not going to make a lot of sense now, but as you start to zoom in and out to kind of judge the capacity of your page, you don't want the baseline grid to fall off prematurely. So if you're at 75% and you zoom out to 50%, it will go away. So I always change mine to 50% so it's reflective of that. And then the other thing I like to do is uncheck grids and back so that if I have a real image heavy document like we will, the baseline grid floats over the top of everything. Finally, I'm going to change this to 0 so it starts at the very top of the page, and I'm going to select a color that is a little more pleasing to me than light blue. I'm going to go with grass green. So we'll click OK, and then I need to turn it on. And to turn on baseline grids, it's Option Command apostrophe. And you can see again that the 9 over 9 gets close, but it's not quite there. You get a little bit of disparity, like a a quarter leaded line, and then it just about hits right on there. That is, for me, a lot of times good enough. I might start dropping in some text, say, and just as an example, I'll put some text in here, and I will actually go ahead and use fill with placeholder text, and I'll drop this down to 11/14, and we'll make it something a little nicer than whatever that was, Advanced Pro Regular, and there you go. So you'll notice one thing about this, and that is that this type is not floating, not sitting on the baseline. It's kind of sitting in between, and what that is actually happening is it's aligning the baseline to the ascender. So if I hit Command B, B as in Brian, it'll pull up the text frames option box, and I'm going to go to baseline options, and I'm going to hit leading. If you hit preview, you'll see that now it aligns it to the baseline, which causes it to sit quite nicely on that baseline grid. So really, this is, for me, all I do about 95% of the time. This is a very simple grid. It's a very easy grid to abide by. It gives you some starting point, but there's enough flexibility. If I have a larger document, I might do it at, say, a 12/12. 9/9 works, 6 over whatever. It doesn't really matter. Again, you're just kind of creating a system that brings a little bit of continuity and minimizes your choices. So if I were going to start for next Wednesday, I would probably start with this. Make sure my baseline grid is reflective of my type, make sure it's on, and then make sure that I have some semblance of some columns and hang lines to kind of maybe play around with. Maybe I decide that this is going to be a little bit larger text, and you can see this is just going to make it so I don't have to kind of, if those weren't there, I might be kind of going, well, is this good? Is this good? No. What I want to do is make sure that not only is it kind of predetermined in a way for me, that when I go from page to page to page, that I can decide that, oh yeah, I left myself a margin of one column on both sides. Again, it can get way more complex, and I'll show you about that in a minute when we do the next video, which is setting up a much more complex and I would say maybe not useful, but tight grid. So switch over to that video if you're feeling kind of adventurous.